Hi there, my name is Graham Hare. I'm the founder of the Eyewitness blog, and this is the first part of an 11-part series on our new video blogs looking at the question of why I am a Christian. Now there are of course many more than 11 reasons why I'm a Christian. There are innumerable reasons why I'm a Christian. But I'd like just to take 11 reasons in particular and to look at them in some detail in this series. And we're going to begin here in part 1 by looking at the Gospels as eyewitness accounts. We're going to spend some time in this series clearly looking at the Bible, and the Bible that we use throughout this series is the English Standard Version, Anglicised edition, so that's the one I'm going to be reading from. So, why am I a Christian? Well, first of all, because the Gospels come across as eyewitness accounts. What do I mean by an eyewitness account? Well, think about some ancient stories. Think about, for example, Aesop's fables. You may know that Aesop's fables are these stories traditionally ascribed to the Greek writer Aesop. The stories in which animals do things that tell a moral tale. So the most famous of these would be the Tortoise and the Hare. You know the Tortoise and the Hare. The Tortoise and the Hare get together one day and decide to have a race. So they have the race. The Tortoise wins because the Hare got complacent, whereas the Tortoise persisted and won the race. Now, is this story historical? Obviously not. You know, tortoises and hares don't just get together and have a race. Clearly it's there to tell a moral story. There's no historical basis to any of it. It's just a nice moral tale, isn't it? And if you're anything like I was in my teenage years, perhaps that's how you view the Bible. Perhaps that's how you view the Gospels. When I was a teenager, I had this assumption that the Gospels were full of nice moral tales, a bit like the Tortoise and the Hare. You know, nice things to teach the kids, nice lessons for life, but no historical basis whatsoever. That was what I assumed about the Gospels. So when I first read one of the Gospels aged 19, it was a bit of an eye-opener. I suddenly realised that here was something that was actually claiming to be recorded history, and more than that, had that ring of authenticity of an eyewitness account. Now, the thing about the four Gospels is the original copies of the Gospels weren't autographed. You know, Matthew didn't put his name Matthew onto his Gospel. Mark didn't put his name Mark onto his Gospel. They wrote these Gospels essentially as anonymous works. The reason we know them as Matthew, Mark, Luke and John today is because early in the history of the church, quite early on, the tradition was attached to them that the authors of these four Gospels were, respectively, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And the tradition says that Matthew was a former tax collector and one of Jesus' 12 disciples, that Mark was a companion of Peter, and that he wrote down the Gospel essentially from what Peter told him, that Luke was a travelling companion of Paul, that he was a physician or a doctor, and that John was another of the 12 disciples. That's the traditional account that we have of the four Gospel writers, and it's quite an early, quite a reliable account. So if that's correct, then it means that two of our four Gospels were actually written by two of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Another one was written by a companion of the Apostle Peter, one of the 12 disciples. And the fourth one, Luke's, was written by a close travelling companion of the Apostle Paul, a very important figure in the early decades of Christianity. So it shouldn't really surprise us that the Gospels have this ring of authenticity about them, this eyewitnessness about them, if that is their history and their authorship. They really do read like first-hand or second-hand eyewitness accounts. What I'd like to do is just take us through 5 examples of this, so you don't have to listen to me any longer, but listen to what the Gospels themselves say. So I'd like to begin with Mark's Gospel. Most scholars believe that Mark was the first of the 4 Gospels to be written. Perhaps it was written around about something like 60 AD, about 30 years after the ascension of Jesus into heaven. And in Mark chapter 14, this is in the passage about Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then standing up and meeting his accuser, Judas Iscariot, with a band of men. Mark chapter 14, verses 43 to 52. And immediately, while he, that's Jesus, was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." And they all left him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Now, I'd like us just to think about that last little detail. It only happens in Mark's Gospel. It's not recorded in any of the other Gospels. A young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Now, because this little incident only occurs in Mark's Gospel, many have come to the conclusion that this is Mark writing about himself. He was the young man who ran away naked. Whether that's true or not, we simply can't know. But why did Mark put that in? What was the reason to put that into this Gospel? If it was Mark, he doesn't name himself. He just refers to this little incident with the young man following. It has the little ring of eyewitness testimony about it, as if someone who was there remembered that happening and Mark decided to write it down. It's very interesting, isn't it? There's no other reason for it to be there other than just to give this little ring of authenticity, if you like, little detail. Well, that was the first of our passages. For B, C, D and E, I'd like to look at 4 passages in John's Gospel. The reason I'd like to do that is, of all the 4 Gospels, I think John's Gospel is the most eyewitnessy of the lot. Remember that we said earlier that if the traditional accounts of the 4 Gospels are correct, John's Gospel was written by one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Many scholars, probably more scholars, believe that it was the last one to be written. Perhaps it was written around 80 AD, so quite a long time after Jesus' resurrection and his ascension into heaven. But nevertheless, it has this real ring of authenticity about it, like, I was there, I saw these things happen. Let's read through 4 passages that kind of illustrate what I'm saying here. I'd like to begin with John chapter 4. So what's been happening so far in John's Gospel? We've started really with John the Baptist baptising in the wilderness, and people have been coming to John the Baptist asking him, are you the Messiah? Are you Elijah? Are you the prophet? And John says, no, I'm not any of those things. I'm just the one preparing the way for the Messiah. And when Jesus comes along to be baptised, John identifies him as the Messiah. He identifies him as the Lamb of God who's to take away the sins of the world. And then we have the incident of the wedding at Cana, in which Jesus famously turns water into wine. And then we have the incident where Nicodemus, one of the chief teachers of Israel, comes to see Jesus at night, and there's that famous passage about needing to be born again, and about God so loving the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him might not perish but have eternal life. And then we get to chapter 4, and it's very interesting what it says at the beginning of chapter 4. This is chapter 4 verses 1 to 3. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. Now that was quite a complex sentence there. There was lots of people hearing things and people hearing that people had heard things. I'll just read it again. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. There's a number of things interesting about this, not least that baptism, after John the Baptist, baptism is hardly ever mentioned in John's Gospel. It really doesn't talk about baptism very much at all in John's Gospel once John leaves the scene. And yet we just get this little insight, this little detail about the fact that Jesus was baptising more people than John, and the Pharisees had heard about it. In fact, it wasn't even Jesus doing the baptising, his disciples were doing it. None of the other Gospels actually record this. Only John, in passing, mentions this little detail about the disciples baptising more disciples than John. And it's when the Pharisees hear about this that causes Jesus to depart for Galilee. Why is this there? It doesn't tell us anything particular about what Jesus was doing. It doesn't tell us anything that seems important in John's Gospel, but it's just one of those little eyewitness details that makes me believe, when I read John's Gospel, that the author was there. The author saw these things happen. He was with Jesus. The third passage I'd like us to share is in chapter 5. It's chapter 5 verses 1 to 5, and again it's very interesting. This is one of the times that Jesus visits Jerusalem. Chapter 5 verses 1 to 5. After this there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralysed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. Now, John doesn't just tell us that Jesus went to Jerusalem and there's this pool, he actually describes what it was like. He says that it's a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, and that it has 5 roofed colonnades. And he says that in these colonnades, a multitude of invalids, the blind, the lame and the paralysed, used to congregate there. Perhaps they were hoping for divine healing. Until not that long ago, nobody believed what John said in this account. Where were these 5 covered colonnades? And then an archaeological dig in Jerusalem actually found this place that John described, this pool, with the 5 covered colonnades. So John actually gave us a bit of archaeological detail that's been verified in the 20th century. And you get the impression, again, I was there, or at the very least, I remember what Jerusalem was like before the Romans burnt it down in AD 70. I was there. I can picture and I can describe to you what this place was like. Okay, well, I'd like to jump now towards the end of John's Gospel. John's Gospel, of course, reaches its climax with the trial and the death and the resurrection of Jesus in chapters 18 and 19 and 20. And in chapter 19, verses 34 and 35, we read this. This is Jesus on the cross, and Jesus has already died, and it's talking about what was happening around the cross just after Jesus died. Verse 34. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. It's very interesting, that, isn't it? He knows that he is telling the truth. He saw Jesus' side pierced, and out came blood and water. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. That the writer of this gospel is telling us exactly what he saw and heard, so that you may believe. It has that eyewitnessiness about it again. And then if we go to John chapter 20, and this takes place on the first Easter Sunday, so this is the morning of the resurrection of Jesus. And the chapter begins with Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene has been very much maligned down the centuries, but in the Gospels she is one of the chief characters. She is always one of the first witnesses of the risen Jesus. And in John's Gospel chapter 20 we have her coming to the tomb very early on the Easter Sunday. Verses 2 to 7. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, that's the writer of this gospel that we believe to be John, and said to them, They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going towards the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there, and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. This is an account of Mary Magdalene discovering the empty tomb and running to tell the disciples. And two of the disciples are Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved. Let's call him John. And Peter and John run towards the tomb, and notice it says both of them were running together, but the other disciple, John, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there. Again, it's a lovely little detail, isn't it? We think that John was one of the youngest of the 12 disciples, so naturally he would have run faster. We also get very strongly the impression from the New Testament that Peter was the one who was the speaker, he was the one who was bold as brass, he was the one who would walk where angels fear to tread. So it shouldn't really surprise us that John gets there first and looks in, but then Peter just strides straight into the tomb. He saw the linen cloth lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. Again, lovely little detail that's just there in John's Gospel, where the face cloth was, where the burial cloth was in the tomb, the way it was folded up. It's meant to show you that Jesus hadn't been snatched, he'd not been grave robbed. The place would have been strewn if he'd been grave robbed. The resurrection had happened and it was all orderly. There'd been time to fold up the face cloth. But it's also one of those little details which says to the reader, at least it says it to me, this was written by an eyewitness. So in the 4 Gospels, and I've just given us 5 passages here, 1 of them from Mark and 4 of them from John. In the Gospels we really have this sense of this is told by people who were there. Sometimes it's written by people who were there, and these little details give us the ring of authenticity to it, the smell of actually being there, if you like. It really is quite different to the Tortoise and the Hare. It's even different to some of the later lives of the saints that you get in the 4th century and the 5th century, which tell the stories of Saint Anthony or Saint Hilarion or Saint Paul of the Desert, or whoever, the stories that Saint Jerome wrote, and people like that in the 4th century. They're illuminating and interesting stories, but they don't always have that little detail of somebody who was there like the Gospels have. It really is remarkable when you read the Gospels that you get these little essences of being there. And that is just one of the reasons that I find the Christian faith compelling. I hope that these 5 passages which I've read have at least whetted your appetite to read one of the Gospels again and maybe look at it with fresh eyes and to ask, could this have been written by someone who saw these events? How close was this writer to the actual things that happened? Well, that's part 1, the Gospels as eyewitness accounts. In part 2, we're going to look at the rest of the New Testament, really. We have the 4 Gospels, but what's in the rest of the New Testament? Well, much of it is the church's internal dialogue. You might think of the Gospels as like early Christianity's advertising literature, if you like. It's written to help you believe. It's written to convince you that Jesus rose from the dead. But in the letters, you have the church's internal dialogue. This is the church talking to the church. And that too, actually, is quite a convincing testimony to the truth of the Christian faith. So I hope that you will tune in for part 2. Don't forget to check out our website, https://etimaste.com. Thank you.